Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on exploring the edit label settings in Genesis R&D. We're so glad you could all join us today for this discussion on some options in the software that will help you fine-tune your label to get them suited exactly to your needs. And of course, we hope everyone stays healthy out there. Before we get into the main topic, let me give you a little background on ESHA research. ESHA was established in 1981 and has grown from offering one of the first nutrition and labeling software solutions to a full suite of products and services, including Genesis R&D Foods, Genesis R&D Supplements, Food Processor for dietary analysis, and consulting services that can provide you with labeling services, formula review, and other special project needs. Today we're working with Genesis R&D Foods, which was introduced in 1991 to address formula and analysis needs and compliance with the NLEA labeling regulations. Over the years, Genesis has experienced continued development and expanded labeling capabilities to Canada, Mexico, and EU formats, and US restaurant and food service labeling as well. We continue to adapt the software to changing regulations and additional options that the governing entities allow and clarify. So keep current with the software, it keeps you current with the regulations. We have one webinar posted on the schedule at this time. In April, we'll review the various reports in Genesis R&D. Stay tuned for more webinars to be posted on the ESHA website in the future. As always, we are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending you a link to that recording, and we'll share the slide deck, so you'll have access to all the information covered. We'll get that to you as soon as we can following the webinar. Also, please note that if you have questions during the webinar, please send those in as soon as you think of them. Don't wait until the end. We have colleagues standing by to respond to those through the chat in the question portal. You can submit questions via the GoToWebinar control panel. If we don't get to your questions before the close of the webinar, we'll reach out directly to you afterwards. With that, I will hand over the presentation to my esteemed colleague, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Chris, and I'm really grateful that we can all gather in this format today and talk about the edit label features in Genesis. We'll focus on US labels today, highlight just a couple other of the countries, but as Chris mentioned, we do have those other country labeling modules in Genesis. Today, I want to show you where to select the label formats in the software, how to add serving sizes. We'll display voluntary nutrients on the label and discuss some of the additional settings like rounding options. And then I'll take a look at the view label screen that you often work with in Genesis. When you create a recipe in Genesis R&D, you can then view the nutrition facts panel for that food or formula. And as you may know, with product packaging and labeling, it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. The edit label features in Genesis begin with the standard vertical format, as you can see here, and then allow the various options that you might want or need based on factors like the nutrient declaration that's required or allowed on the label that you use, the shape of the label that you need, or that you might need to fit your product packaging. And of course, there are a lot of other considerations. The standard label that you see here on the left is pretty much ready to go. It's almost compliant. With this one, you just add the serving size information, and then you would have a, potentially compliant label ready to go for product packaging. And again, you can see other variations of the label here that include voluntary nutrients. There's a simplified format and a linear label that's been modified to fit a specific shape for packaging. There are many more options that you can choose in the edit label settings to create the labels that you need. With U.S. labeling in 2016, we experienced significant changes to the labeling regulations and the appearance of the nutrition facts labels. These changes have been available in Genesis for several versions. Today I'm working with version 11.7, but you've seen the new format for quite some time. A nutrition facts label is more than just a box of numbers, and there are laws that direct the information that must be included. How that information is presented and the allowance of modifications that can be applied, again, are governed by rules that we have in effect. There are many elements and rules that can be missed or misinterpreted, and there are many opportunities in which a nutrition facts label can fall out of compliance. To illustrate this, I wanted to share with you one example of a non-compliant label from an actual product package that was not created with Genesis. And please know that this is not in any way a shaming exercise. I just wanted to demonstrate that there are so many areas and elements of a label that must be considered to achieve proper formatting. And Genesis automates the majority of these, as I showed you on the previous slide with that example standard label. The ESHA teams pay extra careful attention to regulatory detail so that Genesis provides automated formatting to make your work and hopefully your life easier and steer you in the right direction towards compliance. So on this example label, you can notice highlighted areas. I want to just discuss a few. A U.S. compliant label must show a serving size with a friendly household unit. If you're using weight for the serving size, you would show ounces first and then grams in parentheses. Genesis applies a base level of rounding, and then you can choose different options from there. So here, calories for one would be rounded to 400, just as a basic rounding rule. The indications that this label here is trying to be a 2016 label are the inclusion of added sugars, vitamin D, and potassium. And with that in mind, it's not compliant to mix components of the 1990 and the 2016 regulations. So calories from fat is not allowed on a 2016 label. We would expect calories to appear in that much larger, bolder font size for a 2016 label. And added sugars, the quantitative value should never be greater for total sugars, or excuse me, the added sugars quantitative value should never be greater than the total sugars value. So on this label, it's a little bit off there. Vitamin D must be declared in micrograms, while IUs are optional for the 2016 label. You can display IUs, but you must display micrograms for vitamin D. And among other things here, we have spacing issues. The bottom thick line on this label is covering the protein declaration. Potassium percent DV is overlapping the source of calories chart, which also isn't appropriate for the 2016 label. And in this case, it's listing 1990 reference values. This label is missing the percent DV's calories footnote required on the 2016 format. So there's a lot going on here, and if you don't use Genesis and you aren't aware of the regulations and required nutrients and styles and formattings and specifications, you can end up with a clearly non-compliant label. So here's the label, again, created in Genesis with proper formatting, nutrient units, serving size information filled in, and all I had to do was set a serving size for this. Technically, this product could qualify for the dual column label based on the packaging size, but we've covered that in a different webinar. I want to talk about voluntary nutrients. With the 2016 labels, we have a different list of voluntary nutrients than we had with the 1990 NLEA list. For example, vitamin A used to be a mandatory nutrient on the 1990 label. Now it's a voluntary nutrient on the 2016 label. In addition, several of the nutrients experienced a change in the units that are used to declare values. As another example, vitamin A was declared in IUs, and now vitamin A is declared in micrograms representing micrograms of RAE, or retinol activity equivalents. This shows up in Genesis as separate nutrient fields for the nutrient units. So you'll see in Genesis a field for vitamin A IU and a separate field for micrograms RAE. You can see here the list that you might choose to voluntarily declare information, or you may be required for certain fortified products or to support claims that you make on your packaging. And I'll show you where to find those in Genesis very soon. One of the changes with the 2016 FDA regulations is that quantitative amounts for vitamins and minerals is part of the declaration option. For the mandatory vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium, the quantitative values are required for many of the label formats. There are exceptions that apply to the small label formats. And for the voluntary nutrients, quantitative declaration is optional. But when you do declare the quantitative amounts, certain levels of significance apply based on the value of the daily value, that number that's used to calculate the percent DV. For labeling purposes, the FDA defines levels of significance as the degree of accuracy when rounding nutrients for purposes of declaring quantitative amounts of vitamins and minerals on the label. And this is a list from December 2019, 2019, FDA guidance that shows the levels of significance that can be used to report the quantitative values for the vitamins and minerals that appear in the lower portion of the label. Another look at this with the descriptive instructions for rounding the quantitative values and minerals, you can see that the vitamins and minerals grouped by their DV values and the levels of significance that applies to each group. I mentioned that Genesis applies the proper rounding rules for nutrients, and please note that this guidance is not final rule in the CFR. In general, the FDA presents guidance as the current thinking on a topic. So this means that you can apply the guidance as a suggested option, but it's not yet a requirement. If the guidance moves on to final rule, then it may become a mandatory way of displaying the values. So right now we have one setting in Genesis as the default, and then the option to apply the FDA guidance rounding rules. How it does appear in Genesis, again, the default you'll see on the left-hand side here. So quantitative amounts of vitamins and minerals are reported to the units listed in the CFR. And then in the edit label settings, we have the option to apply the guidance rounding rule. So that right side label shows you an example of where the FDA guidance rounding rules are applied. Some slight differences, for some nutrients they may not change, but for some it either cleans up the value or shows a little more precision. And then the last point I want to talk about before we move into the software is the View Label screen. I mention this because it acts not only as the workspace to see the changes that you're making to your labels as you make them, but it also often serves as a report for the label, the ingredient list, allergen information, and more. So we see this as sometimes used as kind of a data sheet or a spec sheet for a product. And when you work in the edit label settings, you can select from that vast variety of options. And here I've highlighted the show button that you'll see in Genesis because it's an easy way to select or hide some of the pieces of this view. So with all of that, let's move into Genesis and I can show you where I might find additional label options and how some of these are applied. So let me open a recipe here in Genesis. And then I'll go to my view label. It gives me the settings again, just as the default first view of what the label might look like. And again, you can see here, a lot of the work has been done for me in terms of formatting and the proper information that I need to see on this label. By default, the label would typically be the US 2016 standard vertical label, as is shown here, but your license can affect this. So if your license has the Canadian labeling module only, then this is likely to be the Canadian 2016 label. And I do want to take just one moment to show you where you can apply the default settings of how this label will appear. So to find the My Preferences, go up to the Home tab and then the My Preferences button. We have this general section here right at the top, and then the regulation. So you can see mine is set to US 2016 NLEA. We also have the older format labels, Canada, Mexico, and then European Union, EU. If you see any of these grayed out in this list, that means that's not part of your license. So here, like the EU label is in gray, I need to contact the support or teams here and get my EU labeling module activated. So if you think that should be part of your license and it's gray, contact support. Or if you want another module, you want access to one of these modules that isn't available to you now, contact our sales team so you can learn more about adding the additional labeling modules to your license. And one note on that, the My Preferences is just that. So anything I set here in My Preferences will affect my copy of Genesis. As an organization, if you want to be all on the same page, you may just want to check your My Preferences to see that everyone's working in the same settings that would be appropriate. So back to the label. I just want to show you the Edit Label settings. So click on the Recipe tab. Again, here's where I had my View Label option. And to get into the various settings for the label, click on Edit Label. And here you can see all of the options and areas that you could work in to modify how this label is going to look. Just to go over these quickly, we've covered them in another webinar, but in this general section, we have the regulation, which again would be the choosing the country that you're working in. Mine is set to US. For some of these, we have category. So for the US labels, we have our 1990 as well as 2016 label settings, supplement facts for the food type supplement food type items is found in here. And we'll keep the 1990 and LEA options available as long as it's prudent. You know, we've met our compliance date for the majority of foods. We have another year to go for smaller companies. And then everyone still needs that time for transition. So those options will remain in the software for some time still. The label section for US, we have adult and child options. And then we also have the dual column. So again, that's based on US 2016 labeling options. Some containers that contain 200 to 300% of the rack may require a dual column label. So that's where you can select that setting. Style, we have our standard vertical, and then we have the other options that allow you to work with smaller package sizes like the tabular label or the linear formats. And the format section for, again, US, we have full and simplified. So those are settings you can choose from. And then again in this section, because it's kind of a primary use and a need for a label, we have the serving size. So here, if I expand my serving size options, I can see different language, English, French, Spanish, again, depending on those labeling modules that you have and the settings that you have applied for a label. You'll want to fill in as much information there as you can. But for serving size, you'll want a friendly household measure to appear on your label. So this is a bread recipe. I can add 2 slices as my friendly household measure. For some labels, it may be appropriate, like a single serve label or a single size serving container to hide, excuse me, some of this information can be hidden. The default unit here is grams. You could also choose milliliters. Hold that thought on the single serving container. So we have the 2 slices will show up as a friendly household measure. And then if I choose to add servings per container, on this particular label, it would be appropriate. So I can just type in a number here for 12 servings per container. This is what I was referring to. If it's a single serve container, then you could possibly hide servings per container, and your serving size would be more of a descriptive information about the container itself as well. So those would be the serving size options. I'm just going to update my label here so you can see those appearing. Let me go back to my edit label settings again. And in the general tab here, you will also see, depending on the country, the regulation that you're set in, a lower section that refers directly to that country. So I'm set in my US label regulations. So I have a US section here that does apply to US labeling law. I have different options I can select for my serving size, an abbreviated version of that, servings per container, phrasing, various options there. And then for US labeling, we could have a bilingual English and Spanish label. So by default, it's set to English as the primary, Spanish as secondary. I could swap those if I wanted to, if it was appropriate. And just to show you, if I do switch my labeling to Canadian regulation, then that updates appropriately. Now I have a Canada section and areas that apply directly to that as appropriate and per the regulations. Let me jump now to voluntary nutrients. I mentioned that with the 2016 US labels, some of the voluntary nutrients and the units changed. And when you're working with the voluntary nutrients, the appropriate list per the regulations that you've chosen appear here. So if I want to select voluntary nutrients to display on my label, I can certainly do that just by checking these on the list. I'll choose a few of those. And that looks good. So again, update this label and it can just show you now my label list of nutrients has grown a bit. And you can see those appearing on the label with their quantitative amounts as is required or indicated in the CFR, and then I have options from there to work with those. So I can choose Edit Label and then go to my nutrient options to select a little more fine-tuning for these specific nutrients that I've chosen. Just within the nutrient options here, some are it's all based on the individual nutrient itself. So you may see different options available per the different individual nutrients. So some of these options might be term related, or the phrases that you can use on the label here. Total carb could be abbreviated, total carbohydrate, or we could just have as the default setting. We also have rounding options for some of the nutrients if it occurs in less than 1 gram or 1 unit of the requirement. You have different options on how to approach those. You could round to the nearest gram, state as less than 1, and stating as less than 1 comes in a variety of different options on how that may be displayed. I'll choose another, like iron. Iron has a couple options. So there is a setting I'll show you in a bit that is the insignificant. So if you choose to show, choose to drop some of the insignificant nutrients down into a footnote, you could then go back and choose individually iron to display rather than in the insignificant footnote. A note on this, the round to the nearest 10th, that was added before the FDA rounding option. So I'll show you the rounding option in a bit that is a more global setting for these vitamins and minerals. For a nutrient like copper, we see the show amount and it's checked by default. So again, I was mentioning that for the 2016 rules, we have this new idea of displaying, reporting that quantitative amount, but for some label formats and for voluntary nutrients, it's not required to show the quantitative amount. You can just display the %dB. So here, if I wanted to hide the quantitative amount for an individual nutrient here, then I could choose to do that. But the default is set to show that amount. And one more, I'll show you folate, because this one has its own special rule. So folate, honestly, I'm not sure that this one is set to show the amount by default. I've messed with my settings so many times, but you can see folate, we have a quantitative amount in micrograms DFE, and then for some items, some scenarios, you would be required to show the folic acid in parentheses following that folate quantitative amount. So if I choose that option of showing the folic acid, it appears properly on the label in parentheses with folate. And one more here, all the way down to the bottom, we have a vitamins and minerals, kind of a more general setting for these. And here it would be for rounding. So when vitamins and minerals occurring in this lower portion are less than 2%, there are a few ways that you can handle the display. The default is set to round to the nearest 2% increment, or you could insert a footnote that states these are insignificant, or set those values to 0. So if it's occurring as less than 2%, they'll show as 0. So a little more generalized setting for our vitamins and minerals. So now I'll move up to format options. And you can see there's quite a list of these. I won't cover every single one, but highlight a few of them. We have one that's used or asked about quite a bit, use the unrounded values when calculating the percent dB. So if you check this one, per the CFR, by default, we'll be using a rounded value for quantitative amounts to come up with this percent dB. Per the CFR, you could choose to use the unrounded value as well, either or. Sometimes it's a matter of what makes sense based on the quantitative value and the percent that's showing up. So you want to pay attention to how that setting might affect the numbers that do display on the label. This one came up recently, the shortened percent daily value footnote. On certain products that could be declared as calorie-free or free of calories, and there's a list of other terms like that, you could choose to use the shortened footnote. And that refers down to here. Let's see if I can scroll down to show that and scroll. So the footnote down here, it's typically percent daily value tells you how much a nutrient in a serving of food contains, and then 2,000 calories is the recommended, or 2,000 calories a day is used for general nutrition advice. So the shortened footnote will hide that second part of this statement. So again, that refers to calorie-free foods or similar that can use similar terminology. Here in this section, we do have additional settings that refer to allergen and ingredient statements on how you might display those. And then again, this lower section has settings that pertain to US regulation. If you were to change the regulation, the label setting for the regulation, you might see Canada here or the appropriate country that you're working in. So some of these settings, you can just see down the list, some that might apply to you. Italicized trans fat is an option. And then here is the rounding that I was discussing. So for the quantitative amounts for vitamins and minerals, the guidance indicates that, like I mentioned on the slides, there are different rounding rules that apply to those quantitative amounts depending on where they fall, how big their number for the DV is. So here it says draft guidance. It is actual final guidance, and we'll be updating that in a future update for Genesis. But if you choose this setting, that slide that I showed you that compared the two different values reporting at the bottom of the label, it could make slight differences to your quantitative amounts. It could possibly change the percent dB depending on the rounding and the display there. And then the show insignificant footnote. I'll just show you those, check that and show you all of those in action. So I'll update my label. Show insignificant just looks for those that are qualify as insignificant and places them down here in the lower portion of the label. So you can see many settings are available in the edit label features. And you just want to be aware of what's appropriate for your label, what is consistent in the information that you are declaring. So the option that you choose all agree with each other, with each other. And then again, I'll just talk a little bit more about this view label setting or view label screen here. I like to work with it if I'm doing any kind of labeling work. I like to have that up and running. So as I work with my recipe and as I work with the edit label settings, I can just see what's happening in kind of a live format for my label. But again, here the view label screen has the label, has the ingredient list, has allergen information, and this additional, we call this the additional allergen statement that is often used as that may contain statement. And we've discussed these in additional webinars. The ingredient statement information can be worked with in this set of features. The allergen statement information can be worked with in the allergen statement set of features, and we cover those in different webinars. But I do want to show you the show button here, which is a handy way to work within all the elements in this view. So if you want to hide, either include or hide any of the elements or the information that's appearing in the view label screen, you can certainly do so. So here, if I want to hide my additional allergen statement, I just click that, uncheck it from the show list, and it goes away. And then other items like attributes or added sugars statements. Once you set these type of features in motion, like we've discussed in other webinars, if you work with your attributes, you might see an attribute listing on this page. If you're working with added sugars type ingredients with those single ingredient sugar items, then added sugar statements may show up here. So those would apply once you've activated that set of features. And I will go back to the edit label and then our format options. I mentioned that this set of features does include some settings that refer to the ingredient and the allergen statement, such as always uppercase ingredient statement. If you're formatting for your ingredient statement, might be some mixed uppercase, lowercase throughout. You could just change it to this all uppercase setting and all of the case is consistent. So another example there. And one last thing I want to talk about here is exporting. The view label page, as I mentioned, it's often used as kind of a spec sheet, maybe isn't the right word, but a data sheet providing the nutritional information and ingredients that we receive from suppliers or get shared throughout the industry. So this can be saved as a document. There are a couple ways to work with that. You might do file and you can print from here or print to PDF, saves it as a nice PDF format that then could be attached to an email and shared. And then the label image itself can also be exported. So if you right click here on the label image, you could choose to export the image itself, and you have a couple options. One is to a file, so you could save that file, or you can just copy directly to the clipboard and paste it where you might need that. And then another option is print as vector, and that's going to save it in looking like a PDF format. The vector file format is one that lends itself to editing, so you could export that to a graphics editor like Adobe Illustrator and be able to work with the image itself and make modifications there. We have a blog, at least a blog, that discusses that in more detail. And of course, if you have any questions about exporting, please feel free to get in contact with tech support. They're well versed in the options and what may be helpful to you. So with that, I'll tell you a little more about our training options, and then we'll cover some Q&A. So our training options have changed a little bit, and I just want you to be aware of some of the changes. I know our ESHA training team has reached out to all registered participants for the April and May training sessions, but just please note that in these current state of travel and these interesting times, those have been moved to a web-based format. And like I said, the training team has reached out to give participants some options of attending the web-based format. And if you were already registered for these, to have an option to reschedule to an in-person training later in the year at our Oak Brook facility. So the April webinar, or excuse me, April training session will be our kind of standard format now. We offer 3 days of training. The first 2 days are what we're traditionally that professional kind of entry level, getting familiarized with Genesis features and some discussion on the labeling and these settings like we've talked about today. So that can be viewed as the first 2 days or just a 2-day training in itself. The third day is more advanced level. So it dives deeper into those more in-depth scenarios and different settings and considerations in Genesis that you might want to work with. And again, that third day could be used as a single advanced day training if you're at that point and have that need for training. The May training session will be focused on menu labeling. So again, it's going to cover the Genesis features, but the labeling portion will be focused on restaurant and food service, that menu labeling set of features and discussion. And the May training, the menu labeling, is a 2-day format. So if you have any questions, if you're already registered, or if you want to register and have any questions, please get a hold of our training team. You can reach them at training@esha.com. And we also have all the information, contact information, and the schedule on the ESHA website. And then one more to mention, we have a June training scheduled for Canadian labeling. At this point, it's listed at the Oak Brook facility, the training facility. Just be aware that that could change. We'll just watch how things are going and update that as necessary, and the training team will reach out to anyone that needs information. But again, that Canadian labeling training, again, will cover Genesis, and then the labeling portion will definitely focus on Canadian labeling regulations and all of the settings that you'll need to know about there. So again, any questions, contact training or check out our training schedule on the ESHA website. With that, I will hand it back to Chris to tell you a little more information, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Nice job, Alicia. Great information. Take a deep breath because we'll be coming back to you for some questions here. So again, a reminder to all our folks, thank you for attending. We have this slide in here so that you can contact us directly. So if you didn't get a chance to get your question in that we were answering in that section online, we will follow up with you after the webinar, or the slide will be available in that recording that we send you, so you can contact us directly, and we're happy to help in any way we can. With that, we have some excellent questions to address from our audience, and let's get started on that. Question number 1. I'm wondering if nutrition facts label that did not apply FDA's guidelines on rounding rules are still compliant with the FDA regulations or not? And is it okay to use a whole number for potassium value instead of rounding it to the nearest 10 milligram increment?
And yes, great question. And yes, so the guidance providing direction on the declaration of vitamin and mineral quantitative amounts was published after the effective date for labeling. So there were already many labels out there in the world that were following the final rule as written. And the final rule remains the written rule. So how it kind of works with guidance, that when guidance comes out, that provides us with optional allowances that the FDA states. This is our current thinking on this topic, and we make this suggestion as a way that either we know industry is kind of all getting on board and doing it this way, but guidance hasn't made it to final rule yet. So while it might be a suggestion, it's not the mandated requirement, so that gives us some flexibility on the choices available there. So it's possible for this guidance to move its way through the proper channels and become final rule, but at this time we can use either that default option or the default setting in Genesis that might round potassium or state potassium as that whole number, or you could choose the guidance option that then rounds it to the nearest tenth. So really, again, you want to look at your values, see what makes most sense based on the numbers that you are reporting, or look at from terms of consistency. If you choose that we're just going to use the guidance option for all labels and apply that consistently, that could be a decision that your organization makes. So we will keep an eye on the guidance, of course, and we update Genesis appropriately. So we'll adapt when final regulation is changed. Great question, thank you.
Yes, and we reach out to the FDA usually when we put those guidance approvals in this before putting them in the software. This is a popular question I know that we get and for the sales team a lot as well. And the question is, how do I report omega-3 and 6 on my label?
That is a great question. Yes, we see that in support a bit. A few different things to consider. So in the US, for food products, omega-3 and 6 are not voluntary nutrients. So you may have noticed they weren't included on that voluntary nutrient list in the software because they are not available to be listed within the nutrition facts label for food products. In Genesis, you can include information in your notes section for the recipe, and you could view it in that label display or the view label screen or report. So that's one way to forward that information and see that information, but it won't report within the nutrition facts label. You can include just a note on that rule. You can include a statement on your product packaging regarding omega-3 and 6, and so that would be more like stating a serving of this product contains this much omega-3 or 6, you know, a clear factual statement on the product packaging, but that would be outside of the nutrition label. And then the US supplement facts label, you could add that as a dietary ingredient within the label. And then in Canada, it is part of the additional nutrients that are allowed, voluntary, or they're additional nutrients allowed within the panel. So there are different rules, but for US food labels, you cannot include it within the label itself. Thanks.
Excellent. Question 3. So I entered niacin to report on my label, but it's not showing up.
That has been happening, especially with the 2016 label. And again, this is where, let me jump back into Genesis, and I just want to show you quickly. So again, we have those voluntary nutrients, and they must be reported in certain units. So for niacin, it used to be in, I want to say milligrams was the unit, and now it's reporting as, yes, milligrams of niacin equivalents. So it is, while it still shows as milligrams on the label here, the unit used is a different field. So it's milligrams of niacin equivalents. So within your recipe, let's just jump into Edit Recipe and go to the Nutrients screen. And then I'm going to change my, I'll just change to Show All Nutrients so we can see these here. If I look at my vitamins section, I can see here that milligrams of niacin was the old unit used on the 1990 label. Milligrams of niacin equivalent is the unit that's used on the 2016 label. So you would have to have information for your ingredients. This is the recipe view, but going back to ingredients in your spreadsheet, we always talk about viewing your spreadsheet. You want to make sure that all of your ingredients have niacin equivalent data populated for this field. And one way, just again with this screen, the nutrient screen in your recipe view, one indicator of the units that you need to be populating is if you look at the %DV column, and here I have my settings, my preferences set to US Label 2016 standards. So it's going to reflect those. The units that are reported here in this %DV column are a clue to which ones must be populated to appear on the label. So just keep that in mind for niacin equivalents. Make sure your information is going into this field, not this field. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's common with dietary fiber as well. Make sure you fill out the 2016 dietary fiber to make sure it shows up on the 2016 labels. Question number 4. How do I get the %DVs showing in the recipe to match %DVs on my label?
Sure, and so that's again, this comes up sometimes when folks are working in a different regulation, I know. So we have %DVs here. And again, back to that nutrient view, we have the %DV column here. And sometimes one is that rounding the decimal places you have shown here. Maybe mine are set to 3 places. So it's showing a slightly different view, and then they'll be rounded. So a couple things going on is the default setting for the label is that it's going to use a rounded value. These values will be rounded and then a %DV determined for the label. And again, that's in all of this is in line here. Sometimes what I see is that this regulation is still set to the 2016 per my preferences, but someone might be working with a Canadian label or another country label. And so those %DVs here would be showing for US, but the label, if it's set to a Canadian label, it may be working off of different standards. So that's where we can see disagreement. Check and see what the differences are and what the underlying values here are, what rounding rules are in effect, and then what regulations you're set to.
Perfect. Could you show an example real quick of how I can show French language on my Canadian label?
Absolutely. So this question has come up. Quebec has its own set of regulations for product sales, and in some areas it may require French only. Kind of in general for Canadian labeling, we see that bilingual French and English label, but in some areas you can use a French only. So here I will just set this quickly to Canada. Not all of my information may be appropriate just by setting this label. Just want to make sure nothing's missing here. Okay, so here I have French only. First, I would show you if I wanted to show French and English, I could set it to show bilingual. So now I have both. But then, so here's what I was talking about, the primary language order. So now I have primary set to French. And I think that's what it may have showed to begin with. Oftentimes my primary may be set to English. So it would show up in English first. But then here we can switch our primary languages. So I'm going to do that just to show you. This is what mine typically looks like in a bilingual. And then I can set my primaries to the different settings, and then depending on which setting is set, show bilingual or not, then I can show my bilingual or I can just show the French only. So just to walk you through all of those steps. This may not show up as the default all the time. Again, I mess with my settings a lot, but there's a French only. And then of course you want to fill in the appropriate serving size information and make that a compliant label.
Indeed. Thank you. So let's see, when I view the nutrients in my recipe, sodium is 394 0.47 milligrams. When I look at my label, it is 390 milligrams. What is the rounding rule for the label?
That's a great question. That one's come up too. So one might expect that it would be 395 as a nice rounded number. But for sodium on the label, there are certain, depending on what your sodium level is set at, a certain rounding rule will apply. So just briefly for US labels, the rounding for sodium, if your sodium is less than 5 milligrams, it would round to 0. If your sodium is 5 to 140 milligrams of sodium, then it's going to round to the nearest 5. And then if your sodium level is greater than 140 milligrams, it will round to the nearest 10 milligram. So there, depending again on that increment, it will round up or down. And so value, if your starting value was 394 point something, then it would round to 390 as that rounded to the nearest 10 milligrams. So that's why you may see some rounding that you're not expecting per the regulations. There are certain rules in effect for each nutrient. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that brings us to the end of our questions as we're running out of time. I guess our proper send-off is a reminder that we will follow up with all the questions again and give everybody a recording of the webinar. We appreciate everyone attending. We hope you all stay healthy out there, and we are here to help in these times. And I think that's it. Alicia, do you have a song or anything you're going to leave us with, or are we?
Not for today, but definitely well wishes.
Yeah. Well wishes, everyone. Thank you very much. We will follow up with you shortly. Have a wonderful day.